conducted several years of field work in Istanbul's working class neighborhoods, so this is partially a working class story too. So I published several articles and book chapters from this research project, and I share the title of the articles with you right now to show different aspects of the book. So I conducted coordinate ethnography in Istanbul, and basically looking at the anti-terror trials and how working class Alevi and Kurdish folks were the main targets of the anti-terror law before the coup d'etat or alleged coup d'etat in 1915, and the performative aspects of anti-terror trials. Urban vigilantism is on drug dealing and the fight against drug gangs in the neighborhoods. Counterinsurgency in Istanbul. In this article, I look at the Gezi massacre of Gazi massacre of. We have several massacres, and some of their names are close to one another. Anyways, Gazi massacre of 1995, and I argue that this massacre was not merely suppressive, but also is part of the social engineering project that actually aimed at calling people into certain subject positions, which I'm going to unveil in a bit because that's also part of the book. Inspirational hauntings and fearless spirits of resistance. I look at the concept of martyrdom and how and the political agency of the no longer engaging with Avery Gordon's theory of hauntings, and showing that martyrs are actually still political agents, and they call folks into active resistance, not just they inspire people into action, not everyone, obviously, and I deal with this, I show this in the book, those who are coming from the lineage of the historically persecuted populations. Sectarianism as a racism. In this article, I show how Turkish racism has a sectarian dimension as well, and it's not just imitative form of European colonial racism, but it's coming from its imperial legacy. And police ethnography abolition runs here, and political theology. This is not a journal article, this is a journal article long response to the book forum put together by City and Society on my book. So those are among the main concepts the reviewers were dealing with in my book, and hence the title. So police, why is it turning off constantly? So police. Okay, Ulrich.
Yeah, it goes on and off, so I'm sorry about that.
I'll try my best.
Yeah.
And we can give up the PowerPoint idea at one point, and I will try to improvise. Anyway, so police provocation politics started as a neighborhood ethnography on state violence in the working class neighborhoods of Istanbul that are predominantly populated by Alevi and Kurdish populations. Alevi and Kurdish populations are not among the oppressed populations in Turkey, but they have been the main constitutors of the left-wing socialist and anti-colonial movement. But then the book turned into a much larger project on global policing, and what led me to explore the global policing was actually a RAND report that I found during my archival research on the internet, actually. And you may be familiar with the RAND. RAND back in the 1960s was directly related to the US counterinsurgency, now appears as a semi-independent think tank. But this RAND report was prepared for the US Undersecretary of Defense, and in that report, there was an analysis of the very neighborhoods that I was conducting my fieldwork. And I was really surprised to see that, because the state violence in those neighborhoods were deemed very marginal. There wasn't any academic work on those neighborhoods when I was working on that project. And that actually, that was what led me to conduct a research in these neighborhoods in the very first place. But then I found this research report, as I said, prepared for the US Undersecretary of Defense, and it was analyzing the neighborhoods in the 1970s, but it was part of the project titled Low Intensity Conflict in year 2000. And it was arguing that in the future, written in the 1990s, looking at the 1970s, and making predictions about 2000s, and saying that in the 2000s, the urban terror the terror in Turkey will take an urban form, and low intensity conflict doctrine will help us to contain this urban terror. So in the book, I then look at the spatial and affective dimensions of counterinsurgency and the connections between the local and the global. So as I said, these neighborhoods, since their establishment in the 1960s, have been main centers of left-wing dissent in Turkey. And in the book, I look at the counterintuitive aspects of governance and social control, and I show the complex and mutually constitutive relationship between the maintenance of social order, and by social order I mean capitalist, racist, patriarchal, heteronormativist social order, and in defense of that social order, the creation of the conditions for perpetual conflict, disorder, and criminal activity by the state security apparatus. So I say that, I show in the book that actually creation of disorder is a policing project. And the puzzle addressed by the book was sparked by the coexistence since mid-2000s in these Istanbul neighborhoods of intense police surveillance and militarized spatial control alongside armed and masked revolutionary vigilante activities and gang activities. So militarized spatial control, police surveillance, and gang violence that coexists in many of the places, both across the global north and south, in the places where working class or underclass or racialized populations live. So these two things coexist, and we know there's a vast literature on why those two things coexist. But what made the thing puzzling for me is that for over a decade, when I started conducting research, for over a decade, there are masked and armed revolutionary vigilantes in the picture too. So if those figures were part of the neighborhoods or part of the neighborhood's complex security regime for over a decade, it means that they are allowed. But why are they allowed, was my question. And what made the things even more puzzling for me is that these revolutionary vigilantes were fighting against drug dealers, criminal gangs, and the police at the same time. But what made the things even more puzzling for me to see that all those people, all those other revolutionary young folks who are fighting against drugs in more peaceful ways, who are taking the issue to the Human Rights Association, trying to attract the media attention to the neighborhoods about the gang problems, organizing masculinity workshops in the neighborhoods to address how this entrance of the drug dealing is provoking masculinist responses from the neighborhood youth, addressing structural problems and trying to find more structural solutions, which is under capitalism is of course impossible. To these problems, they were all targeted by the anti-terror laws. Those revolutionaries who would collaborate with the members of other revolutionary groups, who gained the support of the residents, and as I said, engage in peaceful activities, they were all selectively targeted by the anti-terror laws. So then I was really convinced that this is like this kind of vigilantism, this masked and armed kind of vigilantism is allowed. I could see why, but how am I gonna prove this? Like ethnography has its limits, right? How am I gonna prove this? So I started like Google searching vigilantism, revolutionary, like what am I gonna find? And I found a presentation written by Nicholas Haysom in 1991. Nicholas Haysom right now works for the UN, a high officer in the UN. Back then he was a critical legal scholar and worked as an advisor of Nelson Mandela. And in that presentation he says that during the peak of the anti-apartheid movement, armed and masked black vigilantes were engaging in violent acts in the black townships, and this was actually allowed and encouraged by the white settler regime because they wanted black folks to be the violent ones. And then he further says that this technique is actually the South African security officers actually learned this technique in Algeria because one of the highest ranking security officers of South Africa back then was an observant in Algerian civil war, the war in Algeria, and these are all exported from Algeria. And these were actually written by General Andre Bos, if I'm mispronouncing his name, book called Introduction to Strategy. So I Google searched that book, and I found out that that book was translated into Turkish by the military publishing, military academies publishing house, and it was a must reading in the Turkish military. So, oh my God, they too know this. So, and they are reading this. These are the global connections that I tried to find out. But I still thought that this is not convincing enough. So I need to find some other data, other things. And then I found Gary Marx's very important article based on his research on the FBI archives. So in that research, he finds out that FBI agents who infiltrated into the Black Panthers are the ones who provoked Black Panthers into violence. So FBI agents taught them how to make bombs, how to use bombs, and encouraged them into violence. It is, of course, looking from the state perspective, several birds with one stone. So, if Black Panthers engage in violence, I mean, we need to look at the effect. So this is how anthropology also helps us looking at the state effects to understand the state, because those things are not going to be revealed, those evil things are not going to be revealed by the state security officers. So if Black Panthers engage in violence, it means that otherwise sympathetic white segments of the otherwise sympathetic white public is going to be critical of the Black Panthers. It's not just the otherwise sympathetic white liberals, but black communities will be critical of Black Panthers too, because Black Panthers' violence may turn those spaces into violent zones, and that is exactly my point in this book too. So those people who are responsible, so for the racialized communities, for the communities who experience the state as a life-threatening force, police does not provide security. Police is a source of insecurity. Hence, there are agents local agents who emerge as security or safety providers. So if you turn these populations into a security threat against the very people that they should be or are asked to be or rated to be protective of, that is very successful counterinsurgency. And that is why these masked and armed revolutionary vigilante activities are supported. So not just the otherwise sympathetic white or privileged public would be critical of that, but you wouldn't know, if you live in these neighborhoods, you wouldn't know who is under this mask. Under this mask could be a police officer, could be a revolutionary, could be an agent provocateur, could be anyone. So bring the violence into the spaces occupied by the people who are critical of the government, and let the violence occupy, be part of these places. So can you follow me? So I'm going ahead of myself right now, but this is also the very same strategy used by the British security forces in Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland case has been extremely informative for the Turkish security state. The highest ranking military officers, Doğan Güreş, for instance, in the 1990s, he himself went to Belfast, conducted research in Belfast, and they said that there are a lot of similarities between Northern Ireland and Turkey, and we have to apply the similar techniques. And Turkish security officers who really praised Northern Irish case, I mean British presence in Northern Ireland, they argue that what the success of the Turkish British counterinsurgency in Northern Ireland is to be present in Belfast without being apparently present. So you have to be able to intervene in the space, intervene in the relations among the local people without being directly visible. So infiltrate into the organizations or create these conditions to make people fight one another and turn IRA, for instance, in Northern Ireland into an organization that threatens the lives of the lives of their constituents. Oh my God, I won't be able. I sometimes say this word. I sometimes cannot. Today is not the right day. Lucky, there are other words. Supporters, for instance, or base. Okay. So then, just to summarize, I say that this seemingly puzzling coexistence, the militarized police, intense police surveillance, gangs, and the armed and masked revolutionary vigilantes actually could only be understood within the context of Turkish state's counterinsurgency techniques that are informed by the colonial school of warfare and Cold War and decolonial era counterinsurgencies that have not worked merely to violently repress the dissent, but also refashion a population's dissent against the state. So this refashioning a population's dissent against the state is key here. So what I am doing in the book is not just talking about overt forms of state violence, but covert forms of state violence that requires a lot of anthropological knowledge, actually. So in that sense, because it involves a lot of social engineering projects that are covert, it's a counterinsurgency, in my understanding, is a form of it's a form of governance. And it's also a form of preventive governance. It's always vigilant of the possibility of resistance. Because the ruling elites know that overt state violence massacres, large-scale state violence is productive of backlash. It does or may backlash and turn the populations against the state or further it further energizes the resistance. They acknowledge this very much. For instance, like in the counterinsurgency manuals, they say that we shouldn't create martyrs because martyrs fuel resistance. So they are very much aware of the political agency of the no longer, the political agency of the dead. So they are vigilant of the possibility of the politics, and they know that the root causes, what fuels resistance is very structural. So you see it in the counterinsurgency manuals. They say that the root cause of resistance is poverty. They don't say racism, but ethnic discrimination, blah, blah. So it's not that they are not aware of the root causes. They are very much aware of the root causes. So in that sense, it is a preventative government designed to prevent dissent or refashion dissent and suppress dissent. And I call this as a permanent and preventive war on politics. So my understanding of police and politics is very much informed by Rancièrean understanding of politics and policing, because Rancière allows us to see the police beyond those who are in uniform, or the state security apparatus beyond those that are beyond those who are in uniform, but allows, I find it very anthropological, his understanding, because Rancière allows us to look at the practices of the actors, practices that contributes to the existing order of the things. So anything that contributes to the existing order of the things, such as capitalism, patriarchy, racism, heteronormativity, it's policing. I mean, Rancière doesn't talk about racism and heteronormativity, those kind of things, but reproduction of the order is policing in Rancièrean sense of the term. So in the book, for instance, I show that one of the main aims, the successful counterinsurgency, for instance, is the one who is capable of transforming the dissident subjects of the active and unwitting agents of policing dissent. And that's what I show. So, for instance, this figure is extremely important. So this figure can, and it can be reproductive of policing in the neighborhood. So as long as it's reproductive of policing, as long as their practices contribute to the policing of the working class folks, of the racialized folks, of the dissent in general, it's allowed. So in that sense, what does this have to do with anthropology? It does a lot to do with anthropology. In that sense, policing is a very anthropological project. And a lot of Turkish police officers did their PhDs in anthropology. I wasn't surprised when I found this out. Like when I was a visiting PhD student at Columbia University, I was the Teachers College of Columbia University, and there were a lot of police officers, Turkish police officers there. Back then I was surprised. Then when I started to think about this, it makes a lot of sense to me. Because like colonial governance, because I mean, the history of anthropology is very much shaped by colonialism. So like colonial governance, counterinsurgency and policing is a colonial project, anthropological project. Because as I said, first of all, they know that they can't suppress dissent, resistance by pure force. So you need to repressive techniques backlash, and you need to find out other ways to intervene in the organization of the dissent. In that sense, you need to understand the population, you need to understand the people. So in the counterinsurgency manuals, it's written that this is a culture-centric warfare. So when I first submitted my book to the review, one of the reviewers says that like I want to feel these people intimately. I want to know about their lives intimately. Please provide more ethnographic data. So that's a totally legitimate desire. That's a totally legitimate critique coming from a reviewer. But because in the book in the first version of the book, I didn't explain why I am not sharing certain intimate details. So trying to find an answer to this reviewer, I realized, I Google searched intimate, blah blah. Oh my God, I found a counterinsurgency manual saying that we need to know them intimately. We need to know their culture intimately to be able to intervene in their organization. So, in that sense, counterinsurgency entails various elusive and covert techniques to control and manage actual and potential rebellion populations, and it's not merely a war of destruction, as they themselves call it. It's a war of counter-organization. So, changing the way in which dissent is organized. And the aim of the counter-organization is to destroy or prevent resistance without appearing to be directly waging a war on the populace. As the Turkish security officers appreciated British counterinsurgency in Northern Ireland, being there without visibly being there, intervene in the organization of the dissent without being there. In that sense, so population is the main target, as they themselves call it, of counterinsurgency. And this is how they see the population in a very reductionist way. So they divide the population into three, and they say that there's always an insurgent population, no matter what happens. However the politics of that given country change, there is always going to be a population. They will always be resistant. So these populations are obviously coming from indigenous colonized populations who have historically experienced the state as either a life-threatening force or at best not such a friendly, benevolent force who didn't buy the idea of the state. So in Turkey, these insurgent populations, population-wise, come from Alevi and Kurdish populations. Like the always resisting parts of the populations comes from these two populations, and this is also acknowledged in the CIA documents too. In the CIA's Turkey archives, they say that the left in Turkey is disproportionately Kurdish and Alevi as well. And then there is constantly always a counterinsurgent population. So whatever happens, like there is a minority of the population, they always side with the state. No matter how oppressive the state is, no matter how violent the state is, the other one is gonna resist, no matter how violent it is. The other end, the always counterinsurgent, always be on the side of the state. And there's a big majority in the middle. So they can be swayed either way. Either side with the insurgents or side with the counterinsurgents. So one of the main aims is like to make this big chunk in the middle to side with the counterinsurgent populations. So going back to our Black Panthers story, let's say that Black Panthers who are providing welfare, addressing racism in a peaceful way, this big chunk would align with them in the middle. But Black Panthers are, violent, causing, engaging in violence, blah blah. As I said, white public and also certain segments of the Black populations would distance themselves from them. And also, the other aim is to create rifts among the dissident populations. So one of the main aims of Turkish counterinsurgency, I mean, many of you guys know Turkey, but I'm sorry if I'm stating the obvious, but population matters here. So we don't know the exact numbers of the Kurdish and Alevi population in Turkey, but together they're around 35% of the population, can be even more. So you are a capitalist country, Turkish supremacist country, Sunni country, and you have this like 35% of the population who are actively, no matter what you do, actively resisting against the state, actively rebellious, sometimes more, sometimes less. So you have to separate these two populations from one another. So this is why these spaces are really, really important, these neighborhoods where I conducted my fieldwork. These are populated by these two populations, Kurdish and Alevi. They are shelters for Kurdish and Alevi working classes, and the interventions into those neighborhoods have wider effects on the national level, let's say countrywide level. So when I was doing my research, for instance, there were a lot of urban transformation projects going on in Istanbul, and those urban transformation projects were aiming at demolishing working class neighborhoods, moving the working classes away from the city center. And people were asking me like, oh, these neighborhoods are going to be demolished, like soon they are going to be demolished. I have this sense that no, they are not gonna be demolished because their political role is more important. Because, so a lot of Sunni populated neighborhoods were demolished, moved outside the city center, but these neighborhoods weren't demolished because they are spaces of intervention, as I said. So the kind of violence appears in these neighborhoods, the form of state presences and absences in the neighborhood are utilized in ways to divide the wedge between Kurdish and Alevi populations. That's why what I show in the neighborhood in the book through ethnography. How am I doing with the time?
We started late, so
yeah.
But if you can wrap up in just a few minutes.
5 minutes, oh my God, okay.
Yeah.
Perfect, okay. So I call this kind of counter-organization is provocative counter-organization. So in order to, so provocation by ruling elites of conflict, violence, ideological or religious divergences and rivalries, both among and within dissident communities, within the aim of countering and reorganizing a population's dissent against the state. So in that sense, counterinsurgency, in my understanding, is not just a project of pacification. It's not just about production of docility. It's not a Foucauldian project of production of docility and discipline, but it's also a Schmittian project of production of enmity, active production of enmity. And speaking of Schmitt, of course, first things come to mind is fascism, I guess, right? So Carl Schmitt I'm referring to here. So fascism is at the heart of counterinsurgency. Now I'm panicking. So anyway, so as I said, because it's a culture-centric warfare, as they call it, research ethics and afterlives of our research is extremely important too, and that I address in the book, and I'm happy to discuss more about that. So I realized that our work, we have this understanding that, oh my God, we are forced to publish or perish, and then no one reads our book. Then I realized that no, the security officers are very much interested in the works that are related to the populations that they want to take under control or the targets of the police. So I have, while writing about resistance in the book, I don't reveal anything. I engaged in ethnographic refusal, not just in writing, but also while I was conducting the research. I kind of trained my own, controlled my own ethnographic curiosity, didn't want to learn anything that's not publicly known. So all the things I read writing the book, all the discussions are publicly known discussions. I didn't go to the places, the most exciting places that would provide me with most exciting ethnographic data. I mean, I think it is exciting enough anyway in and of itself, because it can be, as I said, in counterinsurgency manuals, it's written that we have to know their culture intimately, and I'm not giving it to you in my understanding. So this is my politics. But I realized that one of the main actors of resistance is actually the agency of the no longer, the martyred, and it took me 10 years to understand this. So the thing that annoyed me the most, because of my own biases, turned out to be, in my understanding, is one of the most exciting and important things. So I argue in the book, I come up with this concept, inspirational hauntings, the hauntings of past resistance and rebellious and religious subjects. So in conversation with Avery Gordon's understanding of hauntings, where she talks about hauntings call us into the ethical subject position. And I say that hauntings call those who come from the lineages of the persecuted, oppressed populations, and who still in their lives show the continuity of state violence, are also, for them, hauntings can be inspirational and calling them into these rebellious, resistant populations, even though it can be self-sacrificial and work against the person. The connection between the biography and the history for those people are extremely clear, and that's a totally different experience. I'm not coming from a historically persecuted community, so it was really difficult for me to understand those connections, but now I respect that a lot. But also in resistance, today we are talking a lot about abolition. When I write about resistance in the book, I show that how these people, since in the 1960s, for instance, engaged in abolitionist practices, because again, the state is not a security provider, not a safety provider, so you have no chance but to create your own law and order and create your own governance. And they experimented by direct democracy. So in anthropology, we are discussing how these abolition discussions are very much US-centric. But reading Angela Davis and seeing that she is saying that they were very much inspired, she herself is very much inspired by the Kurdish people's experiments by abolition. I think it works both ways actually, like from the south also. These practices can travel from the south to the north as well. It starts in the 1960s with these already existing abolitionist policies, and then 1990s and in 1950, actually not 1920, 15. So yeah.
I have a number of questions building on this. First is about the historical dimension. So you are telling this story always as something that is a Cold War based strategy. But we also know that Turkey's violent record goes way back. And we just talked yesterday about 1890s Armenian massacres. Then 1909, Adana massacre, that we had a talk about that over here last year, and most significantly Armenian genocide. And there's supposed to be a playbook that Turkey itself wrote, as opposed to just imported from the Cold War politics and the US and NATO members. So how can we articulate that distinction between what Turkey imported and what Turkey inherited from its own past practices? Second is about the Fanonian aspect of this whole story, because we know that these days it is not just about counterinsurgency generating bottom-up political forces, reorganization of political forces. Yes, that happens, but also that could create the question that what about the agency of these violent actors. So, and their articulation of their own position in Fanonian terms, because for them, basically, that violence, revolutionary violence, creates the agency, creates the resistant agency. And these days, we know, like with the campus protests and all, we all talk about that, you know, like what resistance means. And another question I have is about the gender dimension. You engaged in an ethnographic research, and you did the field with the revolutionary actors. And the point I made, you know, at the beginning about working class, actually, it very much figures into what you tell. And actually, it is also the one, I believe, that gave you the privilege to understand what was going on in Turkey in 2000s when people were hailing Turkey. You said, look at, you know, the counter public, look at, you know, like what working class is doing, what working class is saying about all that. And you will see that, you know, Turkey is not democratizing now. Turkey is going on a different process. So that gave you that privilege. But also, like, as a woman, as an anthropologist, doing the ethnographic research coming from working class, like, what were some of the pros and cons of your subjectivity, your positionality, and also how would you articulate the gender dimension of what was going on in terms of like how you relate with, you know, like women resistant fighters, women like actors, and as opposed to male actors. And finally, so you dedicated a section on Gezi protests, a chapter on Gezi protests. How can we, I very much like to, you know, like hear more about how would you explain what went on in Gezi protests, because the dark whistle politics in Turkey, as you know, back in 2013, nobody talked about that openly, but, you know, like a lot of dark whistle politics pointed to Alevi uprising, Gezi protests as an Alevi uprising. So, where does that fall in your history? Thank you so much for all these comments.
Thank you for these amazing questions, which require really...
Yeah, we have talked now.
So I'm not sure I will be able to do justice to your questions. I will try my best. These are very, very important, very, very important 4.5 questions. Anyway, so what is important and what is original? I think that's a great, excellent question. And we can write an entire new book on that, and I think there is really, that book is needed to be written also. So, definitely Turkey inherits from its history of violence. There is this continuity of history of violence for the non-Turkish and non-Sunni populations. There is this continuity. The importance of Cold War, though. So, the importance of Cold War, though, here is this, like, in the Cold War, there is this counterinsurgency, the critical analysis of counterinsurgency. See the Cold War period as a rite of passage of Vietnam War protests, for instance, like, because what happened during the Vietnam War is that United States, the various citizens of the United States, aligned with the Vietnamese people rather than their own government, many of them. And that was very threatening for the United States. And then they understood that whatever happens, they understood that if there is an openly unjust case, nationality doesn't always matter, nationalism doesn't always work, and people can align with the forces that your very state is fighting against. So delegitimization of the enemy has become one of the most important concepts of counterinsurgency during the Cold War. So let Asian boys make Asian boys. But that is actually kind of the heart of my book. Like, how are we going to create the conditions of our targets, our security targets, to make their own wars? How are we going to turn them against each other? And I think the own question is extremely important in here, because during the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman state successfully did this in Kurdistan. So definitely in some parts of the book I also talk about this, because Aydın and Emrence, I forgot their first names, They have a book on Turkish counterinsurgency, and in that book they show how in the Kurdish provinces, Cemalhancı, exactly. They show how in the Kurdish provinces they managed to turn Armenian populations and Kurdish populations one another, and then Kurdish population created rift among within Kurdish populations as well. And the history of colonialism is also British colonialism. Again, is very much about turning communities, local communities, into one another. So during the Cold War, they went back to these colonial techniques and brought them. Brought those techniques back again in the 1970s and 80s, 60s, etc. And the contribution of the book is that it is still informing contemporary urban policing. So in order to be understand contemporary urban policing, not only in Istanbul, but in many different parts of the world, we have to look at those counterinsurgency techniques. So, because when we speak of those Cold War counterinsurgency techniques, we always talk like at a broader political, broader national level. But in the local level, it's still playing out. It's still informative of urban policing. So violent actors, I think one thing I should have made clear about violence, I do not say that all forms of revolutionary violence work against revolutionaries. So revolutionaries engage in various different kinds of violence. So there are two chapters on the 1990s. So what we see in the 1990s that after this coup, certain segments of the left in Turkey have been suppressed, and that's the Sunni working class. And that is in the book I discussed this. So I was born in a Turkish Sunni populated working class neighborhood, and when I was growing up, the revolutionary past was like, I had the sense that it was like several decades ago. It was long gone, even though it was less than a decade actually. When I was going to primary school, it was less than a decade ago, but it seems like in a very, exactly, like all of a sudden it was all gone, like there's nothing, like there are some like bad memories, prison, my uncles were in prison, but still like a lot of people's family members were in prison, but resistance is gone. No, we didn't even know why they were in prison. A friend of mine told me once, like, she found a baking powder in the fridge and thought that her father ended up in prison because she's selling cocaine. Because, like, in our understanding in the Turkish Sunni imaginary, those who are doing drugs end up in prison. Then I went to high school, and there were a lot of Kurdish and Alevi working classes in that high school, and I started to go to their neighborhoods, and I realized that, oh my God, like revolutionary struggle is still alive. These people are believing in the revolution, fighting for it's an entire different world. Then in the book, as I say that like it was the coup was repressive for the Turkish Sunni working classes because this was the first time that they encountered the violent face of the state, and it was suppressive for many of them. But for the Kurds, for the Alevis, it was like another chain in the long cycle of state violence, and it wasn't repressive. So the kind of revolutionary violence revolutionaries engaged in early 1990s actually helped them to get popularized. So they were selectively targeting the torturers, those who killed revolutionaries, because there wasn't any justice, like the legal sphere didn't provide any sort of justice. Within the absence of the justice provided by the state, like selectively targeting those who are engaged in mass murder of Kurdish civilians, blah blah, that gained the sympathy of them. So that is what the state actually couldn't have seen. But, so that's why they shifted towards like trying to pull the violence into the places occupied by the supporters of those organizations and contain that violence in that space. So make the revolutionary, transform the revolutionary into a source of violence within the neighborhoods, within the places that those people live, and the kind of source of violence that brings the police into the neighborhood. So that was the kind of violence. That's the kind of violence that the state provokes. In terms of working class and gender identity, as I said, like I already was very familiar with those neighborhoods. I spend a lot of time on this neighborhood, so I could blend in very easily. And I myself also felt like really comfortable in these places. And being a woman actually didn't matter a lot because Alevi culture is such an open culture. The gender divisions are not as visible as it is in other places. So in that sense, it was. I mean, we were talking to Kabir about this on Sunday. Like, on the one hand, it's a dangerous place to do field working, but on the other hand, people are really nice and they really cared about the project. So they were really helpful. I just like because there are other people. So Gezi and Gezi. So I think so. There's a chapter on Gezi in the neighborhood. That's not because I put Gezi, that's the last chapter, at the center of my analysis. And I am also very much critical of many of the analysis of Gezi uprisings because Gezi uprisings happened during the peace process, and that was a very potentially radically transformative era within the history of Turkey. So seeing Gezi uprising as this like rite of passage, a turning point, very important historical moment, in my understanding, veils another actually a really important historical moment that hasn't happened, that what didn't happen in the history of Turkey before them. And I precisely, because of what you mentioned, I analyzed Gezi uprisings for two reasons. Many of the things I heard when people were talking about the 1990s, they became ethnographically very visible to me during the Gezi uprisings because the state violence concentrated into those neighborhoods, so pulling the Kurdish and Alevi people away from the city center, inviting them back to their neighborhoods, fight the fight in your own neighborhood. So, and all the Kurdish and Alevi youth, they knew how to fight the police. They knew how to, resist the police. They were leading the uprising. So first of all, pushing them back into their own spaces, and then associating again those places with violence. See the people who were fighting with in Taksim during the Gezi, a week ago, 2 weeks ago. Are these actually really armed, really dangerous people? Do you see, talking to the middle class Turkish folks, like, do you see who you were aligned with? Like, are you gonna reconsider this alignment? And a lot of people reconsider that alignment. And then I am accusing Alevis of this, organizing this uprising. This is also extremely important. So pulling the Alevis as the target while they are making a peace deal, trying to make a peace negotiation with Kurds. So, see, you are the main target, you are the most vulnerable in this country, and see, I am making this deal with the Kurds, and then remember inviting all that history back and all these mainstream neighborhoods, naming the bridge after Yavuz Sultan Selim. See, Kurds aligned, don't trust the Kurds. Kurds aligned with the state ones, and I observed one of the things that I heard time and again by everyone in the neighborhood: divide and rule, this is how the state works. And then how, that is fascinating, and that is extremely sad to observe that, to see this provocative, affective move comes from the side of the state and everyone is divided. The guy who is telling me that Alevis and Kurds cannot be divided, should not be divided, and then, but this state has always been like that for centuries. They've sided with the Kurds. We are the ultimate victims. So not everyone, obviously. There are people who are critical of this, so life is more colorful than that. But so that is why it's an anthropology project. You have to know the culture to be able to target specific emotions to get the effects that you want to.
Let's get more from the audience. Thank you so much for all your responses. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dennis. This was really great, and I can read to your book. Sorry. So, I have two brief questions. One is more factual, that concerns your ethnographic research, and the other one is more conceptual and theoretical. The first one is about, I think we're about the same age. I also live in Istanbul, and I witnessed some of these things in terms of like certain neighborhoods. They're associated with certain political organizations, and some of these political organizations among the leftist circles never had any good reputation, particularly because they were so prone to state infiltration.
Yes,
I think they're talking about the same political.
Yeah, I know about the organization.
Yeah, I mean, doesn't matter, but I think, what is important here is that it is, it reflects your research in terms of any overall argument about what state wants to do with these organizations. Now, my question is, I mean, I was about to formulate this question in my mind, but you said you're ethnographic denial,
Refusal.
Denial. Okay, now it's making it tricky, but I'm wondering, what are some of your insights about what do the members of these organizations think about this bad reputation about them being bastions of state infiltration and being used by the state against other political groups and, for the state's overall goals? Did you get any insight about, like, whether it's self-critique or not? That's my first question, more ethnographic and out of curiosity. And the other one is more conceptual theoretical. We briefly chatted about this yesterday, but you in your articles and other publications, and I presume in your book too, you use the concepts of racialization and coloniality and colonization as the engine of your overall analysis. Now, I personally agree with the value of and use of these concepts and theories, but I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about, since these concepts come from mainly European colonial experiences, what are some of the shortcomings, opportunities, dilemmas of using these concepts for the Kurdish-Turkish related case?
Well, thanks a lot. Shall I answer?
Do you want to click forward?
Okay. Yeah. I don't want to break your train of thought. Thank you. It was a very interesting presentation. And I take your point about the use of anthropology as a lens to look at issues like this. We just had an election here, and I wonder, staying in a very abstract realm, as an anthropologist, can you help us understand when these tools begin to be used? How will we identify them? How will we know? Is there any, does anthropology provide insight?
Yeah.
Maybe in post-Vietnam.
Yeah.
context.
Country, manual. Outside and yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. So thank you for these great questions. So about these revolutionary organizations who have the reputation that align with the state, or there's a lot of state agencies infiltrated, I didn't talk to them about this, but I heard other people accusing certain organizations. But what I do in the book, that is why ethnography is, I think, important, and that's why I find Transyrian concept is very important. It doesn't matter, I'm not a detective, I can't prove that there are agent provocateurs, or it's not my job, I'm not interested in that. So that's what the important thing is, to show the effects of their practices. So these aren't revolutionary so that actually contributes to the policing of those peoples, because it contributes to it aligns with the security state's aims. So as long as those that aligns with the security state's aims, then it's policing for me. That's what I show in the book. So let's look at the effects of these actions rather than like trying to pinpoint, like you may be a radical revolutionary group, but your practices may serve, and people reflect on that. Like they reflect. It's not that they don't, revolutionary groups, they don't reflect on the effects of their, as I said, like certain groups are organizing masculinity workshops, like more transformative things. In terms of racism and colonialism, that's a great question. I've been working on this and writing on this for some time now. So in my Sectarianism as Racism article, I show that, so a lot of literature on Turkish racism shows that it's mimetic of European colonial discourses and European colonial racism, which there is a value in it. Like it's very, Nada Maksutyan's work, for instance, is very important. There's another new emerging literature. But in my sectarianism and racism, as racism article, I show that Turkish racism is not just an imitative form of European racism, but it also borrows a lot from its imperial legacy, and that's why Turkish racism, looking at Turkish racism, can teach us a lot about the histories or other multiple modalities of racism, both intersections of non-Western racism and Western racism, and separately the two of them. So, for instance, racism against Alevis is it's a very original case. So it emerged in the, I think there needs to be a historical research on it. I'm not an historian, but for me as an anthropologist, what I find really illuminating is that how these anti-Alevi discourses emerged in the 1600s. I don't know if they continue throughout the history, because I mean, Hamid Bozaslan says that we can talk about this like continuation in the Ottoman history, there are changes, but how they came back, at least in the 19th, with the establishment of the Turkish Republic, how they are utilized and how they are used to portray Alevi people. This is really, because you know, in racism we know that like uncivilized, creating the uncivilized indigenous other who doesn't believe in the God, blah blah, like, so the connection between religion. In the Turkish history too, there's a connection between religion and racism. But pushing out of human civilization works in the way that accusing Alevis of breaking the original taboo of human civilization, engaging in incest. So this is an animalization, and a different form than it was done it worked in Latin America against the indigenous people of Latin America. But this is also pushing out of civilization, animalization. We see them like in the article. I show some writings of Ömer Seyfettin, for instance, or some leftist Kemalist authors. They say that, like, you know, like in Turkey there used to be, and there are still these people who sleep with one another like animals. Like they even say animals, and they are called Alevis, for instance. This is like pushing. So I think we need to look more into the non-Western forms of racism. I'm right now editing a book titled Global Ethnographies of Police Racism. So there are multiple forms of, we can't be, I mean, one way to avoid Eurocentrism is also looking at multiple modalities of colonialism and multiple modalities of racism. So European racism or European colonialism is not the only way of colonialism. Like there are different contexts, there are different local historical contexts that inform, but it doesn't mean that there is no colonialism. So we have to look at those differences too. As an anthropologist, I care about that. So how can we identify? Again, I would say, like, how do we identify? By looking at the effects. So what do the police do? So I gave a lot of book talks, and some of them in Rome, for instance, one anarchist group invited me to give a book talk, and they told me that this is exactly what they've been seeing in Rome and in Barcelona too. There were some activists from Barcelona, but they cannot prove this. Like they could see that the police is actively provoking these groups into violence, or like one of the, for instance, in Gary Marx's article, it clearly says that like the infiltration is not just about like provoking into violence, but provoking disagreements. Like, you know, sometimes we feel like these leftist men, you know, like they believe that they know everything, that they actively disagree. There are these figures in the organizations like who don't want to agree in anything. So like those, regardless, either they are police agents or not, but what they do is serving to the ends of policing dissent. So I think just like be vigilant of the effects of the practices, I would say.
Thank you. Kabir?
Yeah, thank you. I have a question about the Schmittian moment, the kind of creating enmity
Mm-hmm.
between groups. You were talking about in a specific case, kind of trying to create enmity between Kurds and Alevis.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about how, like, what that requires is, first, also, like, maybe even in the first instance, persuading people that these are two different populations. it's not that Kurds are always not Alevi, and it's not the case that Alevis are always not
Exactly.
Kurd. And so if
Exactly.
you're kind of assuming that the goal is to create enmity between, you first have to create these as two separate groups
Yes.
that might align or might not
Yeah.
align. And I wonder if you could just talk about
Yeah,
that.
that's an excellent question. That's very true, and I always had the sense that like there are Kurdish Alevis too. Like there's an intersecting identity over there. And I think what I've seen again looking at the effects, they can divide Kurdish, like they can create a rift within one person's identity. So like there are a lot of Kurdish Alevis who either identify as Kurds or identify as Alevis. It is as if this has to be like mutually exclusive. And there is a lot of investment. That's why I say like policing is not just about those who are in the uniform. So academia is part of it. All this intellectual knowledge production is all of that. So, for instance, in my chapter on the Ghazi massacre, so when the state attacked Ghazi neighborhood, and they shout like the police shout like we're gonna kill you all, we're gonna kill you all, we're gonna kill you all Alevis. A lot of people told me that that was the moment that I became an Alevi. I didn't think that I was an Alevi. I thought that when the state was attacking here, they were attacking because this is a leftist movement. So I call this like a sectarian violent interpellation. So the state, well, in the act of killing, saying that I see you as an Alevi, but when it says I see you as an Alevi, it also an order, you need to become an Alevi. It's like Hannah Arendt, like, Hannah Arendt says that I grew up in a very secular household, like I didn't identify as a Jew, but whenever I stepped outside the home, I was attacked as a Jew. So if you're attacked as a Jew, you defend yourself as a Jew. So all these like violent moments that specifically targets Alevis, a lot of people told me that those are the very moments that they became Alevi. They began to identify Alevi and realize that Alevis are killable subjects. And then, so Kurdish Alevi, for instance, began to identify more as a Alevi person because attacked of that identity. And then bringing all these historical discussions back. So I was like, all these, for me, like the fieldwork in the neighborhoods was travel in time. Like you are going to, so I'm not saying this like in a very modernist perspective or like, because history matters. For history still informs these people's presence. So when this Yavuz Sultan Selim Bridge was announced to be built, like in the neighborhoods, people began to talk about this, like, Kurds killed us. So that comes into the local discussion. And those historical enmities, historical violence, intervenes into the present and it produces these enmities. I find it like really fascinating. It's like how effectively it works. So it is like, because also like in the book you would see that in addition to ethnography there are a lot of like media analysis. Like what does media say in specific events, like framing, all these like framing of the discussions, that is all counterinsurgency. It's like a chain of multiple actors. I'm not sure if this is making, so in the when Ghazi massacre happened, this, what I said happened, but in addition to that, there Alevi organizations who actively advocated that Alevis are Turks. They received a lot of funding from the government. They were created by the government. So there is that side too. Like it is like, as I said, multiple connected actors at play.
Thank you. And we have a piece of good news. We have the book actually here.
Oh.
The bookstore,
Oh,
brought the
that's
book.
great.
So please, if you want to get the book, wait till the end. And we are going to get the last round of questions. Nilay and Ayça.
Okay. So, like one question I have is about the urban regeneration. You said that those capitalist sort of influences do not go into those neighborhoods.
No, they do. I mean, not exactly.
Okay, so I was wondering that relationship between the violence and the sort of the control of a group of community, politically, and its connection to the sort of the capitalist expansion within the urban. You somehow tied those two.
Yes.
things,
Yes.
So I was wondering if you gave more thought on that
Yeah.
or.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Interesting to hear that. And then the other question quickly, if we have time, is like when we think about these American influences in Turkey, the Cold War and how like Turkish society dealt with its own population. I mean, there's a lot of like, all the Gladio kind of literature, but we don't have the literature that really connects that influence, that defense, Round Corporation document to the ground.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if you came across anything like maybe within the population that you sort of talked to, some memory of that kind of like, like breaking points, like things changing, in a certain way, where we could, trace those, influences. Because like I'm also, working on a similar thing. I mean, it's really hard to connect what is going on in Iran. I mean, there's some sponsorship of terrorism studies in Turkey that you can trace it very well. But then, how it applied in police, that connection is kind of missing. If you have any thoughts on how to do that connection, like intellectually and research-wise.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dennis, for this great talk. You said in the presentation that you already had an idea about how counter-insurgency and the policing of violence works in these neighborhoods, and then this prompted you to go and search for how these kind of strategies and tactics are important from place to place in a global context. So I was wondering where this insight into the workings of counter-insurgency in the ground come from? Like, what were the ethnographic underpinnings that kind of like gave you the idea? I mean, it could be something you don't want to talk about, like connected to your ethnographic refusal, but if you can tell us a bit about the beginnings of research in that sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's very short in 2 minutes, please.
Yes, 2 minutes, both questions. Okay. So thank you so much. In terms of like how this, so there is no direct link, obviously. I mean, they don't reveal those things. Like the archives are not open, those kind of archives. But so the RAND document, as I said, that was titled Low Intensity Conflict Doctrine in year 2000. So it was already saying that we are going to transform these areas into low intensity conflict. So I have these 2 chapters from 1990s, and those 2 chapters shows the shift actually. So in the early 1990s, there is this like more repressive forms of the state presence was present in the neighborhood, and there was it didn't manage to suppress the dissent. And at the same time, there was also more repressive forms of state violence in Kurdistan too. So like checkpoints, this is when the neighborhoods of the residents call themselves as Gazas of Istanbul. Checkpoints like military vehicles, surveillance, the state is extremely visible, present as a suppressive force. But the Turkish counterinsurgents understood that by this way they are not able to suppress the dissent. So they shifted their strategy into low-intensity conflict by the second half of the 1990s, and Ghazi massacre was a turning point for them. And with regards to because the counterinsurgent in Kurdistan has been really informative too, and both ways, I think. So, for instance, Ümit Özdağ had written a book titled Low Intensity Conflict. They've written books titled Low Intensity Conflict, and he says that this was published in mid-1990s, and he says that we couldn't win the war against, we couldn't win the psychological warfare against the PKK. We need to invest in the psychological warfare, winning the hearts and minds. So this is, for instance, like turn the places into low-intensity conflict zone. So make, for instance, like Kurdish freedom, members of the Kurdish freedom movement, fight Hezbollah, create the Kurdish Hezbollah, make them fight one another, let Asian boys make Asian wars. So this is the low-intensity conflict. So you can see it in that's why I think anthropology is important, but that's why also I think ethnography is must be supported with archival work, looking at what's also happening at a larger scale, and then trying to find like the resonances. So yes, in terms of ethnographic ideas, so there's a lot of ethnography in the book because I mean a lot of things are also very visible, publicly spoken of. The ethnographic idea, as I said, came from like when I realized that there are drug gangs, there are so allowed. We know that like drug gangs are allowed, like in the global south, in, you know, like Brazil, you know, all around the world actually. And then there is the police, and then there is the masked revolutionaries, and then there's the other peaceful revolutionaries who had been really collaborative with other revolutionary groups and with the Kurdish liberation movement. They were all detained. So that was my first ethnographic curiosity, and that helped me to focus, because originally I wanted to explore the violence taking place in the 1990s. I felt like I witnessed this violence, I've seen a lot of, you know, my friends witnessed this violence. I want to write about it. Like I want to write about the checkpoints that I saw. I want to write about these like hundreds of masked police officers coming to the neighborhoods, raiding it. But then I realized that, oh my God, like this is just the top of the iceberg. Like it's much more complicated, much more nuanced than this, and much more covert. And the covert one is the most dangerous one actually, because it's like changing the ground. So that's what made me to focus my attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.